The letter arrived on a Wednesday. No knock on the door, no footfall in the hall. Just a plain white envelope on the kitchen table, as if it had been there before the table itself. Inside was a single sentence, typed in blocky black letters. "She is not your mother." David stood with his hand in the air, still holding the torn edge. In the next room, she hummed an old tune and scraped a wooden spoon along a pot. Onions, butter, the faint mineral smell of tap water at a rolling boil. Ordinary things. Anchors. He read the sentence again. The words did not grow kinder. He set the envelope down as if it might crack, and told himself it was a joke, a prank, some algorithmic marketing stunt. He even mouthed the words, "That's ridiculous," but his voice didn't leave his throat, and the house listened to his silence. That night, he ate across from her at the small table by the window. She asked 3 questions with the same stitched-on smile she had always worn. "Long night at work? Did you sleep? Do you want more?" He pushed food around his plate. He wanted to say, "What lullaby did you sing when I had a fever at 6?" He wanted to ask, "What was the name of the neighbor who brought oranges when the power went out?" But those questions would come out like accusations, and there was no safe way to accuse your mother of being something else. "Is something wrong, dear?" she asked, and the dear was glossy as new plastic. He said no without moving his mouth much. His fork tapped ceramic like a small hard clock. After she cleared the plates, after she wiped the table with that meticulous half-moon motion he could have timed with a metronome, he went to his room and sat on the bed with the envelope. He turned it over looking for a watermark, a message impressed into the paper, a scent. It smelled like nothing. It carried no stamp of origin. He whispered the sentence into the air, and the air did not change. That was when he saw the shadow. It was in the far corner, where the lamplight failed on principle. Tall, precise, as straight as a ruler laid upright on the floor. It had edges. It had a tension. It did not breathe. David didn't think to scream. His lungs folded, and he listened to his heart count his options. He blinked once, slow, expecting the shape to resolve into a coat on a chair, the illusion of sleep. But when his eyelids lifted, the corner was empty. Empty except for another envelope lying where the shadow had stood. He did not cross the room so much as arrive, knees soft, soles soundless. He opened it with his thumbnail and read, "Don't let her touch you." He slept in his clothes. He woke to the smell of coffee and buttered toast. He stayed in his room until the smell congealed into memory and ceased to be food. When he stepped into the hall, she was there as if she had been designed to fill exactly that shape. She reached out in that same practiced way to straighten the collar of his shirt. He recoiled so quickly, he rattled the picture frames. Her smile faltered. Just a slip. A hairline fracture across an expression he had always assumed was molded, not painted. "Breakfast, honey," she said, and the honey landed wrong, as if the word had been kept in a jar too long. David mumbled something that was not no and not later, and moved past her sideways without letting air brush his sleeves. In the bathroom, he locked the door and leaned his forehead against the mirror, cool glass, breath fogging a shallow arc. His fingers shook. He opened his mouth and tried on his own name to see if it still fit. At work, he watched security feeds that played people on loops. A man with a briefcase who always arrived 4 minutes early. A woman who always tied her scarf in the reflection of the elevator door. A night custodian who always paused at the bottom of the stairs like someone was calling his name. Pattern was comfort. Pattern said the world made sense when you weren't looking at it. But there are patterns that keep you safe and patterns that keep you asleep. On the second night, the shadow returned. He knew it before he saw it, the way you know a storm from the taste of the air. There was a pressure against the corners, a new weight to the emptiness. He turned, and it was there, closer, the height of a door, the width of a person who had never been born. He tried to speak. The question that should have come out was, "What are you?" But what left his mouth was his fear stitched into a shape of curiosity. The shadow tilted its head. It made no sound. Something fell at his feet with a paper whisper. Another envelope. "Look in the basement." The basement was a story you told children about mold and nails and the weakness of old wood. He had never had a reason to test the story. The lock was old, and the key had always been kept in a bowl high in a cabinet behind flour and baking soda. The things you only reached for to pretend rituals still mattered. He went down when the house had taught itself to be quiet. Each step spoke in the language of houses: groan, settle, warn. The air changed at the bottom, wet, iron, the tired electrical breath of a bulb that was planning its retirement. The first thing he saw was a wall of photographs, not in frames, pinned, hundreds of them. The paper edges curled like petal tips in winter. The subjects were precise. David at 8 in a shirt with a dinosaur and a stain he had lied about. David at 13 with hair he had cut himself in the mirror and then pretended he liked. David at 23 in a security uniform that fit like an argument. David asleep. David eating. David reading the back of a cereal box with the attentiveness of the lonely. In none of them was there a mother, not even the blur of a shoulder leaving. The backgrounds were careful to exclude her. A table set for one. A couch that never sagged on the left side. Birthday candles that had to be lit by the same hand that made the wish. He stepped closer until the photographs became a geography of white borders. A moth lifted like a tired thought. Behind the last row, he saw another envelope taped to the concrete with a strip of old medical tape. Run. The first thought that came into his head was not from what, but from whom. He had a name hanging on his lips, but refused to say it in case names were doors that only opened inward. Upstairs, the sound of a drawer, then another, the kitchen telling itself to stay busy. A footstep on the stair, then another. Those careful pauses at the risers, like someone listening for the cue they already knew. David? Her voice carried warm and plush as a blanket held too close to the mouth. What are you doing down there? He did not answer. He backed up until the wall taught him there were no more backward options. He looked for another door and found only wall. There were hairline cracks in the concrete, little river systems made by age and stubborn water. He followed one with his eyes until it disappeared beneath a shelving unit where preserved peaches died quietly in glass. Her footsteps accelerated, a metronome forgetting its manners. When the light flickered, it was not the bulb announcing retirement. It was the house holding its breath. Her face appeared at the bottom of the stairs, staged perfectly in the yellow cone of light. She smiled. The crack in the smile had been repaired, seamless, flawless. Practice makes perfect. Don't creep around at night, she said, and the sentence had 3 beats, none of them human. David glanced at the envelope in his hand. Run. He didn't trust his legs to carry him past her. He slid behind a column, putting old concrete between his body and the stairs. The column was cold and honest. Her foot touched the basement floor. The second foot followed after a performance-grade pause. Come here, she said. You're shivering. He found his voice. Don't touch me. The house tightened 1 notch. He felt it in the throat of the stairs, the clench of pipe, the small inward motion of doors you only notice when you're looking for exits. David, she repeated, and the shape of his name in her mouth made him feel like a key in the wrong lock. He moved sideways along the wall, counting breaths, because numbers still worked. 3, 4, 5. She took 5 steps before she remembered to swing her arms. He slid the shelving unit with his shoulder, glass clinking like teeth. Behind it, concrete. Behind the concrete, if you were a child, a hope. If you were a man, a plan. Stop, she said. You'll break something. The softness snapped at the edges, a polite voice at the end of its contract. He reached up for the pull string of the bulb. Then he didn't. It would put them both in the dark, but darkness is not fair when one of you brought it with you. Another envelope slid across the floor from a place that had not existed a second ago. It came to rest against his shoe like a small, obedient animal. He bent without looking away from the stairs and opened it by feel. 1 line. Ask for the 4th song. He didn't understand until he did. He had never heard her hum anything besides the same revolving trinity. When you live with a ritual long enough, you stop naming it. He breathed in iron and damp and old peaches. Sing me the lullaby, he said, aiming his voice like a thrown rope, the one with the train and the moon and the bridge. It's late, she said, a perfect human excuse assembled by a committee. Please, he said, and crafted the word from a child he half remembered. Please, Mom. Silence shifted into place like a heavy book on a shelf. She began to hum, the first song, the one that sat like a coin on the tongue. She washed into the second without thinking, like a habit that did its own remembering. The third arrived with a flourish, then nothing. The silence after 3 had the wrong texture. David felt something in him answer, not relief, confirmation. That particular cold you only get from the truth. He stepped out from behind the column. He kept the shelving unit in 10 feet and a dangling bulb between them. He did not look at her face because faces ask for more than bodies can owe. "What did I call you when I chipped my tooth on the mailbox?" he asked. "You didn't chip your tooth on the mailbox," she said sweetly. He smiled without humor. "I know." He heard footsteps upstairs in the unoccupied air, as if a memory had decided to rerun itself loudly, or as if the house were stacking sound like plates to distract him. The shadow slid along the far wall, like ink spilled with intention. It was taller now, closer. He felt seen by something that understood his fear, as if it had practiced inside of it. Another envelope, soft against his heel, behind the peaches. He put his shoulder to the shelf. Glass chimed obediently. He pushed until his muscles argued, and the shelf gave up 2 inches of allegiance to the wall. There it was, a line of concrete, a softer gray, fresh, decades ago. Plaster that had never learned to talk like the rest of the house. At the base, a hairline crack widened like a mouth. He ran his fingernail along the seam and felt the tremor of something on the other side answer him. "Come upstairs," she said, closer now, voice lower, like the stairs had taught her how sound should travel. "Please, you're scaring me." He wanted that sentence to be true. He wanted to hand it his fear and let it hold it for a while. He wanted the world where onions and butter and a practiced smile were simply a life shared with someone who knew him when he was small. He slid his fingers into the crack and peeled away a strip of plaster. Dust feathered the air, tasted like chalk and old recipes. Behind the wall, a space, not a room, a pocket, just big enough for a person who had learned to become quiet for a living. He pressed his ear against the new mouth in the house and heard breathing that had a history. "David?" The voice that came through the plaster traveled with weight, like letters sent through rain. Older, dry, breaking at its own edges. A voice that had already tried not to ask and failed. "Is that you?" The world bent, not much, enough to put different things next to each other. His throat closed on his answer. He scraped a wider mouth, tore his nails, used the edge of a jar lid as a tool, made a small child's mess for a grown man's reason. When the hole was a wound you could see through, he put his eye against it. On the other side, in the pocket made for keeping, an older woman blinked against the sudden shape of light. Skin papered thin over bone, hair gray the color of questions, hands bound with cloth that had once been a dish towel, eyes that recognized him with the patience of years. "Baby," she said, and the word hit him like a door, opening onto the years he couldn't reach until now. "I knew you'd find me." Behind him, a footstep that did not respect the agreement people have with floors. He turned, and she, the one upstairs, the one with perfect edges, stood 6 steps into the room, her smile repainted, her hands empty and wrong. "Who are you talking to?" she asked, and the question put on concern like a coat that didn't belong to it. He did not answer. He tore the hole wider. The plaster gave up like it had been pretending to be a wall and was grateful to stop. He slid in his arm until his shoulder complained and his hand found a wrist that beat like a small, stubborn drum. "Don't," said the one by the stairs. She took a step, and then another, and then remembered to move her arms. "Don't touch me," he said, not to her. To the air she was training to be near him. The shadow changed location without traveling and stood between David and the stairs, a posted warning where a person might have been a shield. It did not raise a hand. It did not have to. Another envelope came on a small wind that might have been invented for the purpose. "Walk away at midnight." He looked at the old woman through the wall. "Can you stand?" "I can hurt and move," she said, which is almost the same. He widened the hole enough to prove it could be done, enough for a person made of decisions rather than muscle to slip through. He pulled. She came forward with the careful speed of a life being returned to its owner. The other one watched. Her smile hovered like a choice no one had consented to. "What happened?" he asked, and the question was for the wall and the years and the habit he'd mistaken for love. "She needed a shape," the older woman said, breath sawing, voice threaded with a history of not being believed. She took mine. We lived like a prayer said wrong. She hates midnight. She hates outside. She hates being called to sing. The clock in the hall said 11:56, and if clocks could plead, this one was doing it. He slid his arm around the older woman, kept his body a geography that did not include the other one. He moved with her up the stairs, the shadow a silent mile marker at his back. The house moaned to be left. The kitchen tried to keep them with the smell of what could have been a life. At the top of the stairs, the other one stopped. She stood on the first floor, like an idea that couldn't pass a test. She watched him like a photograph you put on the wall so you don't have to ask the person in it to stay. David, she said, and for the first time, the name sounded like she was testing it rather than wearing it. He looked at the clock again, 11:58, the second hand sprinting with dignity. He moved through the living room with the older woman's weight on his hip. The door was 3 steps away, and then 2. His hand was on the knob, and the house leaned toward them like a person who wanted to hear the end of a story. "Don't go," said the voice behind him, and beneath the plea was a note he had never heard in a human instrument. He opened the door. Night air fell into them like an answer. Cool, leaf-sweet, electric with insects doing their work. The porch boards accepted their weight without questions. The yard was a dark shape with patient grass. The street had taught itself the quiet of late hours. "Midnight," he said, and the clock in the hall said now in its precise little language. They stepped into the yard together. The older woman leaned on him with the weight of bones that had had to do too much remembering. At the threshold, the other one stopped, as if the air had drawn a line with chalk. She smiled the way a mask does when no one is inside it. Her eyes were open and empty. She lifted her hand, and for a second, it was too long. Then she remembered and shortened it. She placed her palm against the invisible border like a child learning there was glass between her and the animal. "Come back," she said gently. "It's cold." "Sing the 4th song," David said, and the sentence felt like locking the right door. She did not sing. She pressed her hand harder against the air, and the air refused to become a door for her. The shadow stood on the porch, a milepost, a judge, a companion, none of the above. It inclined its head and became the kind of absence that can be read as gratitude. The older woman began to cry without sound, tears like a body taking inventory. She touched David's face as if dusting off an heirloom. "Let's go," he said, and they went because some sentences reward you for saying them out loud. They crossed the sidewalk and the street paid them no mind. The neighbor's porch lights stayed dark because the kind of nights that matter don't advertise. He helped her into the passenger seat of his car, buckled her in like you do for the person who buckled you first. His hands shook once like a horse throwing something it didn't need. He started the engine. He didn't look back until they reached the end of the block. The house stood in the rearview mirror with all the innocence of a murder weapon washed clean. A figure at the door, still as a portrait. The porch bulb blinked twice and gave up on pretending. He drove. They did not speak for the first 10 minutes because there are silences you earn. The road unwound. The older woman's breathing took on the rhythm of a body that might remember how to sleep. "Hospital?" he asked, because asking is a way of staying between futures. "No police," she said softly. "No forms." "Hospital isn't forms," he said. "Hospital is fluorescent lights and not enough blankets." "It's also names said out loud," she said, and the weight of that sentence was larger than the car. "We can do that later." He nodded. Later is a word that stretches for the people you love. He pulled into a 24-hour grocery lot lit like daylight had misplaced itself. He parked by a cart corral where things that hold other things are taught to wait. He turned off the engine, and the quiet arrived on schedule. "Do you remember," he said carefully, "the winter I fell on the ice and knocked out my breath?" She smiled then, small and real, and the smile had edges that belonged to the person making it. "You came home furious at air for being a traitor. And you made you hot chocolate and told you the trick," she finished, and the two of them held a memory between them like a photograph that needs 4 hands to keep from fluttering away. "You breathe out first, then in, because your body is smart if you treat it like it is." He laughed, and the sound startled him because it had been put away for company. He put his head on the steering wheel, and the car became a room they could afford. After a while, the older woman said, "She'll wait there a while. She'll be patient until she's hungry. Then she'll forget to pretend. You know her," he said. "She's old," she said. "Older than anything that has the right to want. She uses names like stairs. She liked the sound of yours." He watched his hand on the gear shift, a hand that could do things. "Why the envelopes?" The older woman looked past him, and for a moment he thought she was watching the shadow where it sat in its own absence in the back seat. But when she answered, she was watching him. "Because you're the kind of person who listens when you read," she said. "Because when someone tells you don't let her touch you, you don't ask only if it's true, you ask what if it is. That's how people get free." He didn't ask her how she knew about the envelopes. He didn't ask her if the shadow was a thing that could be thanked. He put the car in drive and felt the world decide to be possible at the edges again. They found a motel with a number for a name and a vacancy sign that blinked like an eyelid with a tick. He carried her bag that wasn't hers and signed a register that had seen kinder pens. In the room, he layered the blankets like a strategy and put water to boil in a plastic machine that had retired from making coffee and now specialized in comfort. He washed dust from her wrists, slow in the yellow bathroom light. He didn't apologize because some tendernesses are bigger than sorry. She caught his hand and squeezed, and that simple pressure wrote the story of everything she had not been allowed to say. "Sleep," he told her, and the word obeyed her before she obeyed it. He took the chair by the window and watched the parking lot hold its own little weather. He closed his eyes for a second and saw the wall, the way it relented, the way a house tells the truth if you show it the right kind of patience. When he opened his eyes, there was an envelope on the nightstand. He hadn't heard the door. He hadn't heard the air. He picked it up because that is what you do when the world speaks to you in paper. Count her breaths. He counted because numbers still did what they promised. 1, 2, 3. Eventually numbers become sleep if you are lucky. He reached 97 and the night reached him back. He woke just before dawn, the motel curtains holding a thin gray that belongs to people who have survived their own houses. The older woman slept, her face slack with the kind of rest that mends a person even if it has to do it slowly. He let himself breathe out first, then in, like you do when the air has become honest again. On the table by the door lay an envelope he knew hadn't been there because he had taught himself the shapes of emptiness. He opened it with a fingernail that still remembered plaster. "She will look for you. Do not answer the door." He folded the paper back into itself and put it in his pocket. When the woman woke, he would tell her the part she didn't need to know yet, in the order that made the most safety. He made tea with water that smelled faintly of other people's mornings. He set the cup on the nightstand, and the steam walked up into the new day, like a promise you can't quite put your finger on. He sat back down and watched the motel breathe. He listened to the world remember how to be simple at this hour. He waited. At 8:11, someone knocked on the door. 3 times, polite, practiced. He did not answer. "Housekeeping," said a voice that had learned how to wear vowels. He did not answer. Silence stood up and stretched. Another knock, less polite, the kind of knock that expects a life to continue on command. "David," said the voice, and the second syllable did a thing to the air that your mother's mouth should never do to the air. He slid the chain across the latch so quietly the chain could keep a secret. He moved back to the chair. He counted breaths that weren't his. After a while, the hallway gave up. He waited an hour because the envelopes didn't often ask for patience outright, but always implied it. When the older woman woke, he handed her the tea and the world warmed by exactly the right number of degrees. "We'll need a name," she said, looking at the door like a person in a photograph who has decided to step out of it. "For me, I mean. Until we go say the old one out loud to someone who writes things down." "Pick one," he said. "Try it on." She smiled again, smaller, stronger. "How about Ruth?" "I always liked how it sits in the mouth, like truth without the hurry." "Ruth," he said, and the name fit in the room better than any furniture. He told her about the envelope. He told her about the knocks. He told her about the air at the door mispronouncing him. Ruth nodded like a person petting a dog that would never be allowed inside. "She'll try again." They always try again, but trying isn't the same as getting. He looked at the thin curtains. Morning had made itself useful outside. What do we do now? We become a story that's hard to eat, Ruth said. We go to people who believe names and dates and plaster. We tell them about a wall. You keep reading the paper when it comes. And when someone knocks without being invited, you let the door learn a new habit. He laughed again, easier this time. And you? I'll learn to sleep without counting the silence, she said. And maybe I'll hum a fourth song. He looked at her hands. He looked at his. He thought about the house and the pictures and the shelf that had tried to keep peaches fresh after their time. He thought about the way certain sentences refuse to stop being true just because you want to be tired. He stood and opened the drawer of the motel desk. There was a Bible there, as there often is, and a pad of paper and a pen that had gone to war. He took the pad and laid it on the bedspread that had seen too many shapes of people. What are you doing? Ruth asked. Making our own envelope, he said, in case anyone else ever needs to read their way out. He wrote carefully, blocky black letters the way someone had written to him. She is not your mother. Then beneath it, smaller. Don't let her touch you. Look in the basement. Ask for the fourth song. Behind the peaches. Walk away at midnight. Count her breaths. Do not answer the door. When he finished, the room felt like a place where a plan had been spoken out loud. He tore the page off and folded it twice and slid it into the Bible, because sometimes you have to hide the good news inside the officially approved kind. Ruth watched him with that particular softness you reserve for a version of yourself you wish you could have met sooner. You're a good reader, she said. I had the right teacher, he said. They checked out at noon. The clerk didn't look up because noon was busy in a small way. David held the door for Ruth, and sunlight shook itself all over them like a dog. The car opened its mouth to let them in. The road gave them a line to follow. At the end of the lot, he looked in the rearview mirror out of habit rather than fear. There was no shadow in the back seat. He did not know if that meant it had left or become the space where gratitude goes when it's done needing to be noticed. They drove. The house would stand for a while, patient as a tool. Eventually, someone would buy it and repaint the walls a color with a name that sounded like a fruit. They would knock on that particular patch of basement and call it sound, unless the paper made it into the right pair of hands first. Back at the motel, the maid who had not knocked stopped to straighten a bedspread that sagged with the shape of a knight survived. She dusted the nightstand and moved the Bible enough to notice something inside that had a different hunger than prayer. She opened to the page and read the first line. She frowned. She read the second. She looked toward the door as if expecting someone, anyone, to do the right thing. She slipped the paper into her apron and told herself it was because trash shouldn't be left in books. But she did not throw it away when she emptied her cart. That night, a woman in an apartment 3 streets over opened her door to find that the world had delivered her a plain white envelope. Inside, a sentence that made the room tilt. She sat down very slowly in the nearest chair. The air changed shape, and somewhere that is not on any map, a tall, careful absence inclined its head and kept watch. The story isn't over yet. Every envelope leads to another secret, another night, another choice. Follow our channel to uncover what happens next. Don't just listen to the horror, be part of it. Join the party, if you dare.